All right, this looks great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Montclair State University, virtually. My name is Zoe Burkholder. I am a professor of educational foundations at Montclair State, and I'm the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education Project. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our event this evening. I am so excited. The title of our program tonight is Counterstory in Education, Critical Race Theories Pedagogy for Social Transformation. And it's going to feature Dr. Asia Martinez, who I will introduce formally in a minute. And we are very excited to hear from her and then have a Q&A session following her talk. So thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to start off this afternoon by welcoming you all. So thank you for joining us. I am able to take a look at the registration link so that I know we have with us here this evening quite a few Montclair State University students at the undergraduate and graduate level, many of whom are studying to be teachers or in the Women and Gender Studies program or who are in the English program. So thank you and welcome if you're a student at Montclair State. We also have dozens of educators with us here this evening. So there's local teachers and educators in our public schools and surrounding districts, and a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming and thank you for your interest in our program. I'm sure it is going to be a great one, as well as staff member and faculty member from all sorts of different departments at Montclair State. So we're very excited to welcome you all, and I'm sure it's going to be a great program. One of the things that is exciting about tonight's program is that it is a chance for all of us to consider how critical race theory can be applied as anti-racist pedagogy in education. And I think this is a really timely opportunity to consider this question. As you may know, if you've been reading the newspaper recently, there is increasing interest in critical race theory and how it is used in schools by conservatives. And so this subject has become the topic of a kind of expanding culture war in our society at this exact moment. And in a second, I will drop a link to you in the chat box to a newspaper article from just a couple of days ago in the Washington Post, where once again, leading conservative Republican politicians are attacking public schools, claiming that critical race theory is causing problems and that it's teaching children to be racist and that it should be removed from public schools. As a lot of you know, critical race theory is a kind of well-established academic position and set of theoretical assumptions that allow scholars to examine the history of racism and inequality in different institutions, including education. So many scholars, including Dr. Martinez, use critical race theory as an anti-racist lens, trying to promote social justice and create better, broader equality for all students in our public schools. That means that this gives you all an excellent opportunity this afternoon to hear directly from a scholar who does critical race theory in an applied way in education, and to consider for yourself how this can work to help promote equality in the schools and whether or not there's anything to the critique that it is problematic. I think that it'll be great to have this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, at this point, I would like to take a minute to introduce our speaker for this evening and to introduce my colleague who will be talking in just a minute. So to begin, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Asia Martinez, who is an assistant professor of English at the University of North Texas. Her scholarship is published nationally and internationally and makes a compelling case for counterstory as methodology in rhetoric and writing studies through the well-established framework of critical race theory. Her book, Counterstory, The Rhetoric and Writing of Critical Race Theory, has been named one of the 20 best new rhetoric books to read in 2021 by Book Authority, which is really exciting, congratulations, and is nominated for the 2021 Teaching Literature Book Award. That's 2 prominent awards. This is really great work. It's a terrific book. I'll drop a link to the book in a minute. Her writing has appeared in many publications, including College English, Composition Studies, and Rhetoric Review. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Martinez. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. I'm now going to turn the microphone over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Jess Restaino, who is the director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program at Montclair State University and a professor of writing studies. Her most recent book is Surrender, Feminist Rhetoric and Ethics in Love and Illness. Surrender was the recipient of the CCCC 2020 Outstanding Book Award. You'll have to tell us what that stands for in a minute because I'm not sure. In her life outside of the university, she serves as chair of the board of trustees for Planned Parenthood in Metro New Jersey. Thank you very much. Jess, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And I just want to thank everyone for being here, and in particular extend a really warm welcome and a lot of gratitude to Asia Martinez for joining us today. It's my pleasure to just say a couple quick words. I have my copy right here, and if Asia was here in body, and when we do actually meet in person, which will happen, I'm bringing my book. I'm gonna ask you to sign it. It's a beautiful an important book, and it does so much work at once, and that's one of the things that I think is so critically important about this book. It is at once theoretically rooted, but also ambitious. It's imaginative, it's playful, it's historical, it's capable of exploring kind of at personal depth, with honesty and courage. It does so much work. And then imagine all of that. There's also teaching resources here. There's actual teaching materials, there's assignments. It just does so much work. And so it's very moving. And it's a real honor to see this work happening in our field. And then the last thing that I want to say about it, and I think we kind of don't talk about this enough for academics, right, is that it's also beautifully written, and sometimes we kind of don't always hold academic writers to that task of really writing beautiful prose, right? And Asia's work also does that. So it's just a joy, and I'm so grateful to have my copy, and I hope that you're able to get yours as well. And in the meantime, without question, it's just great to learn together today. So without further ado, Asia, it's my pleasure to welcome you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Asia Martinez, and we'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zoe and Jess, for the introductions. I'm really honored to be with you all today. I am recently relocated to North Texas, where I just moved in July of last year and spent the previous 8 years in upstate New York. So the Northeast is something I've come to hold close to my heart, and I'm more than familiar because of going to the city quite often, of aspects and areas of New Jersey, and so just the general beauty that's happening over there right now I'm definitely missing, because it's already getting kind of hot here in Texas. So here we are, Counterstory in education, and as Zoe mentioned, a hot topic, something that I am really honored to speak with you all today about, because I think there's so much misconception and misinformation being spread about what critical race theory is. And so I'm hoping that this talk will demystify that some. So even if you still, after this talk, leave thinking, no, not for me, not for my classroom, you at least know what you're saying that to, instead of some of the misinformation that's being spread by state legislatures, including in my own new home state. I woke up to the news on Monday morning that the state legislature here in Texas had passed legislation to ban it in K through 12 institutions. So very timely as a topic. Again, my name is Asia Martinez. My pronouns are she, her. One of the things that we have available for us, I believe Zoe might have already dropped in the chat, and if not, is access to all the materials I will be sharing and discussing today, for both accessibility reasons, but also just, moving forward, if we want to reference any of this, you'll have the complete transcript that I'm reading from, and in addition, my slides and the chapter from my book, my 5th chapter in the book, that I'll be referencing as well. So this link will take you directly to a Google folder with all these documents. So let me make sure. Okay. A student once asked if there's ever a point in which we, minoritized folk, will get to stop justifying the methodological choice of telling our stories. I believe that we've all been telling stories all along, but some stories are elevated to the status of theory, scholarship, and literature, while too often minoritized perspectives are relegated to marginalized or overlooked cultural rhetorics, methods, or genres. Well, I don't know when or if these academic gatekeepers will arrive at a point of admission that all work, especially in the humanities, is story. I do know that narrative has always been theoretical. My research makes a case for critical race counterstory as a rhetorical research methodology and method by reviewing counterstory through its critical race theory methodological origins and influences, while also analyzing and illustrating the methods of Richard Delgado, Derek A. Bell, and Patricia J. Williams, who I term counterstory exemplars. Delgado, Bell, and Williams are foundational critical race theorists whose respective counterstory methods of narrated dialogue, fantasy allegory, and autobiographic reflection have set a precedent for other scholars. As such, counterstory as methodology is the verb. The process, the critical race theory informed justification for the work, whereas counterstory as method is the noun, the genre, the research tool. On September 22nd, 2020, the 45th President of these United States issued an executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. This executive order states, many people are pushing a different vision of America that is grounded in hierarchies based on collective social and political identities, rather than in the inherent and equal dignity of every person as an individual. This ideology is rooted in the pernicious and false belief that America is an irredeemably racist and sexist country, that some people simply on account of their race or sex are oppressors, and that racial and sexual identities are more important than our common status as human beings and Americans. And placing particular focus on our institutions of learning, the order continues, there are instructors and materials teaching that men and members of certain races, as well as our most venerable institutions, are inherently sexist and racist and are appearing in workplace diversity trainings across the country. This executive order and the 45th president's remarks issued before and after the order, even during the first presidential debate, called particular attention to critical race theory as the ideology responsible for this, quote, different vision of America, which then begs the question for many Americans, I hope, what is critical race theory? So because this talk is focused on anti-racist pedagogy, let's first review and learn about the ideologies, histories, and methodologies of this movement, federally vilified by the 45th President's administration and, as I mentioned most recently, by the Texas State Legislature. My engagement in the CRT field builds particularly on the powerful work of critical race theorists who define critical race methodology as a challenge to majoritarian stories or master narratives of white privilege. This methodology rejects notions of neutral research or objective research and exposes research that silences and distorts epistemologies of people of color. Importantly, critical race methodology recognizes that experiential knowledge of people of color is legitimate and critical to understanding racism that is often well disguised in the rhetoric of normalized structural values and practices. A critical race methodology includes a range of methods such as family histories, biographies, autoethnography, cuentos, testimonios, and counterstory. Critical race theory is characterized by several major tenets that function as epistemological and ontological premises. These following tenets inform the ways that CRT scholarship is conducted, especially as it relates to its activist orientation. Beginning with the first tenet, permanence of race and racism. Racism is endemic and a central, permanent, and normal part of US society, operating concurrently within multiple forms of social oppression. Taylor asserts that, quote, assumptions of white superiority are so ingrained in political, legal, and educational structures that they are almost unrecognizable, and that because it is all encompassing and omnipresent, it cannot be easily recognized by its beneficiaries. Derek Bell describes a racial realism as racism's permanence, in addition to its centrality, through his assertion that racism lies at the center, not the periphery, in the permanent, not in the fleeting, in the real lives of people of color and white people. In the effort to end all forms of oppression, critical race theory challenges dominant ideologies and liberal claims of race neutrality, equal opportunity, objectivity, colorblindness, and merit. Concerning education and institutional injustice, CRT's second tenet questions arguments against policies like affirmative action and interrogates admissions and hiring practices that claim neutrality in their selection of candidates while justifying a passing over of people of color on the colorblind basis of merit and fit. As Solorzano and Delgado Bernal argue, racialized ideological paradigms act as camouflage for the self-interest, power, and privilege of dominant groups in US society. This self-interest informs CRT's third tenet, interest convergence, most notably discussed by Derek Bell within the context of racial progress discourses. Bell's theory of interest convergence argues that white elites will tolerate or encourage racial advances for people of color only when such advances also promote white self-interest. And this form of racial progress and regression is cyclical rather than inevitable. The most commonly referenced example of this theory resides in the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which is generally taught and remembered as a moral victory for African Americans. But as Bell has pointed out, foreign policy concerns were likely the driving force behind this decision. As Taylor recalls, this case came to light during the Cold War era when televised images of US racial brutality were more readily available to the world. Communist powers such as the former Soviet Union and China sparked international sensations by bringing forth stories and images of police brutality unleashed during peaceful protests and Ku Klux Klan lynchings. These stories and images effectively worked toward undermining the US as a model of democracy, just as the country strove to position itself as a leading force of anti-communism. The Brown decision then came to represent not a blow to American racism, but to communism, and was heralded by the Justice Department and the Truman administration as such. CRT's fourth tenet, race, a social construct, overlaps with and is informed by another racial theory, most prominently Michael Omi and Howard Winot's theory of racial formation. Although biologists, geneticists, anthropologists, and sociologists agree that race is not a biological determinant, humans nonetheless have and continue to taxonomize human bodies racially. As social constructs, these categories are the outcome of an unstable and decentered complex of social meanings, constantly being transformed by political struggle. Further, social constructs of race assert a permanence of race and describe the dimensions of race as maintained by racial projects that function to secure race as fundamental in the structuring and representing of the social world. Sojourner Truth is one of the earliest US writers to describe the first part of CRT's fifth tenet, intersectionality, a lived reality theorized as an analytic framework by CRT scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. In her notable speech, Ain't I a Woman?, Truth narrates one of the earliest US expressions of an intersectional consciousness, calling attention to and turning on its head our society's tendency to organize along binaries. Beyond the black-white and woman-man binaries, Truth's lived reality demonstrates the intersecting aspects of her identities and how their combinations play out in various settings. In 1989, Crenshaw theorized and named intersectionality in her landmark essay, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. Crenshaw's examination counters the single-axis framework of binaristic racial or gendered analysis and demonstrates how this analytic structure does not accurately account for the intersections of race and gender, thus contributing to the marginalization and exclusion of Black women in feminist theory and in anti-racist politics. Twin skin to intersectionality is anti-essentialism, the second half of CRT's fifth tenet. CRT denounces essentialism, countering culturally racist assumptions that attempt to describe or explain socially constructed racial groups as homogenous in the way we think, act, and believe. For reasons of navigation, survival activism, and social justice, none of which are mutually exclusive, there can be a sense of solidarity among cultures or racial groups. However, individuals within groups maintain rights to heterogeneity of perspective, experience, lifestyle, and identity. As such, CRT scholars caution against essentializing cultures and racial groups and believe an anti-essentialist method involves centering experiential knowledge so as to better elucidate lived reality from, which is intersectional, rather than about, which is essentialist, people of color. Education scholar Gloria Ladson-Billings has traced the history of interdisciplinarity as a sixth tenet in legal scholarship, confirming the use of other disciplinary traditions was considered heretical, and departures from canons such as Delgado, Bell, and Williams' rule-breaking legal storytelling were rejected. Specific to education, the field where CRT most prominently progressed before branching out to other fields and disciplines, Ladson-Billings recalls a similar battle, stating, for much of its history, education research and scholarship was moored to psychology. Thus, real research was only scholarship that was neutral and objective. In all, the premise of interdisciplinarity insists on carving pathways for scholars from disciplines steeped in unyielding commitments to canon. In the spirit of the 1960s activism that resulted in the establishment of ethnic studies, CRT pulls on a variety of scholarly traditions towards centralizing and making sense of experiential knowledge. So then a commitment to the centrality of experiential knowledge comprises CRT's seventh tenet. CRT scholars recognize and have developed the methodology of counterstory to relate the racial realities of people of color while also providing methods for minoritized people to challenge the myths, presuppositions, and received wisdoms that make up the common culture about race. Further, as Bell has observed, the narrative voice, the teller, is important to critical race theory in a way not understandable by those whose voices are tacitly deemed legitimate and authoritarian. The voice exposes, tells and retells, signals resistance and caring, and reiterates what kind of power is feared most: the power of commitment to change. CRT's eighth tenet, a commitment to social justice, is arguably the most distinguishing characteristic for CRT's narrative method of counterstory. While there are many stories, and while many data are narrativized, counterstory is distinguished from other forms of storytelling due to its transparent commitment to a liberatory and transformative response to racial, gender, and class oppression. CRT then, and its methodology counterstory, use a narrative method to theorize racialized experience. And as a necessary function of counterstory, these narratives serve the purpose of exposing stereotypes, expressing injustice, and offering additional truth through a narration of the researcher's lived experiences. Through my years of work as a CRT researcher, writer of counterstory, I've learned firsthand of counterstory's potential for achieving social justice. A question I often encounter when speaking with audiences about counterstory is, are all marginalized narratives counterstory? While there are indeed many marginalized narratives, the measure remains whether the tellers and stories subscribe to CRT's tenets that we just reviewed, particularly in their critique of a dominant ideology and their sustained focus on social justice as an objective. In other words, what are folk using counterstory to do? Expression of minoritized subjectivity is a good starting point, but it is equally important to include the admission of and critical self-reflection on your own privilege. My privilege is that I'm a very educated person with the platform of this project. The question then is, what will I do with this platform and privilege? What kind of project will I craft? What is my contribution? And further, as an audience member once asked, what is the political weight of this work? I believe the answer lies in what I maintain as one additional tenet for CRT, and that's accessibility. Derek Bell's exemplary counterstories are bestsellers. Patricia Williams' work has been reviewed by mainstream presses as she continues to write a column for the popular press of the nation. And Richard Delgado's work, published in law reviews, yes, has also been reworked as an introductory text for high school students. Their work continues to inspire and resonate across generations and disciplines. My writing process has included and always will include my family, non-academics, because the work is for them, is sometimes about them, and is nearly always inspired by them. And if my work in Counterstory is inaccessible to the very people it is for, well, then what's the point? Why do the work if it's inaccessible? Thus, in my contribution to defining CRT with you all today, I also advocate for the premise of accessibility, in the sense that the methodological consideration for Counterstory should always envision a multiplicity of audiences beyond just the ivory tower, so to speak with rather than for and over others' communities. Okay. So now that we've reviewed the ideologies and in particular the tenets of CRT, I'll shift the focus of this presentation to a discussion more explicitly concerned with counterstory in education and how these tenets serve as foundation to critical race theory's pedagogy for social transformation. The concluding chapter within my book, a chapter I have provided for you all in the linked materials, serves as a call to action for educators, particularly those in rhetoric and writing studies, to consider critical race theory's implications and application in their own educational research and teaching practices. CRT has always been concerned with the colonizing functions of education that act as a conveyor for hegemonic whiteness. And CRT teacher scholars have always aimed to disrupt this hegemony with transformative educational heuristic and praxis. Beyond crafting curricula with CRT and counterstories as primary texts, and you can see some syllabi examples of this in appendices A and B of the provided chapter, the theory and methodology of CRT and counterstory can inform a transformational education that can be employed as a frame to revise, revision, and craft curricula in a plethora of disciplines. And again, there's also syllabi examples in appendices C and D of that provided chapter of this kind of frame application. Critical race theory arose out of the lived experiences of students and teachers in US law schools who were witness to and subject to liberal civil rights ideology that failed to address the constrictive role that racial ideology plays in the composition and culture of American institutions. CRT scholar Angela P. Harris has reflected on her own miseducation as a law student, maintaining that students of color during her generation navigated their legal educations, never finding a place where discourses concerning lived realities and racial critiques entered the legal canon. In fact, as Harris recalls, none of my professors talked about race or ethnicity. It was apparently irrelevant to the law. There was only one law, a law that in its universal majesty applied to everyone without regard to race, color, gender, or creed. Derek Bell took active notice of these erasures and absences in the curriculum and thus developed and taught legal doctrine from a race-conscious viewpoint and used racial politics as the organizing concept for his students' scholarly study. Bell crafted counterstories with pedagogical intent meant to facilitate classroom discussion. Additionally, Bell's course textbook that you see here, Race, Racism, and the American Law, was developed, published, and centralized within his own curriculum in the early 1970s and served as a foundation and a curriculum plan for what was called the alternative course, which was a student-led course on race and the law at Harvard Law School. This course is remembered as the first institutionalized expression of CRT as a movement, as it challenged the mainstream liberal notion of which subject matters were of enough value to include in a standardized core curriculum. Importantly, this student-led and teacher-led activism and the existence of this course in general are evidence that a primary CRT concern has always been a critique of education and curriculum towards social transformation. By the mid-1990s, CRT was incorporated from legal studies into education. At the 1994 American Educational Research Association meeting, AERA for those of you who go to this meeting in the audience, Gloria Ladson-Billings and William F. Tate's paper presentation identified the tenets of CRT's relevance to the study of race and racism in education. Reflecting on her contribution of CRT to education, Ladson-Billings says, quote, "I argued that CRT could serve as a heuristic for new understandings of multicultural education. CRT scholars were working to deploy race and racial theory as a challenge to traditional notions of diversity and social hierarchy. Informed by and overlapping with CRT's tenets, but also from my perspective as a rhetoric scholar, aspects of the rhetorical situation. CRT's heuristic, as theorized by scholars in education, offers the following guidelines to educators who aim to frame their pedagogy and the crafting of curricula with critical race theory. First, educators should work from a premise that racism is prevalent in American society in general and in education in particular. This tenet alignment is permanence of race and racism, of course. Second, educators should question the dominant claims and discourses of their field. So that aligns very well with that challenge to dominant ideologies tenet. Next, educators should historically ground their coursework, acknowledging the importance of context. Where did this work come from? To what were these authors responding? Which again aligns well with permanence of race and racism, Bell's interest convergence, and even race as social construct. Next, educators should aim for interdisciplinarity, drawing from a range of literatures, which of course is also the same as the tenet. Next, educators should centralize the experiences of perspectives of the minoritized as a focal point, not a passing glance for a day or week's thematic focus. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but doing, Latinx Literatures Week within a core course doesn't quite cover it, does it? And then last, as a follow-up to centralizing those experiences and perspectives of the minoritized, educators should acknowledge and make themselves aware that there's diversity within experience. So of course, this aligns with intersectionality and anti-essentialism as the tenet. Ultimately, the goal of CRT is social transformation, and the heuristic of CRT in education is aimed at the social transformation of educational research, classrooms, curricula, policy, the study of knowledge, and teaching. As Daniela N. Cook observes, CRT's maintained focus on the centrality of race elucidates the fluid, shifting, yet consistent message of white supremacy and how it operates in the policies, practices, and everyday schooling experiences of students, teachers, and the larger community. Further, Counterstory as a methodological frame that centers the stories and lived experiences of people of color embodies an epistemology for how and why particular methods are chosen. A social transformation of education insists that educational researchers change the structures that prevent transformation, that prevent all students from receiving the same opportunities to learn and succeed. As Dixon and Rousseau argue, quote, "Just as the new song of the spirituals was a call for freedom and justice in an unjust world, CRT not only puts in front of us the image of a heaven in which all God's children are able to sing their song, it also demands that we find a way to get there. And for me, that way is methodology. That way is Counterstory." At the core of my academic identity, I'm a teacher scholar who centralizes the theories and methodology of critical race theory within my writing practices, but also within my classroom. My body of work as a CRT scholar and educator reviews the histories and theories of CRT with close readings and analyses of 3 CRT counterstory exemplars, of course, as I've mentioned, Richard Delgado, Derek Bell, and Patricia J. Williams. I make a distinct case for Counterstory as a viable research methodology and writing method in public and academic spheres. And while my book's final chapter is the explicit pedagogy chapter, it's arguable that all the chapters are pedagogy chapters because CRT has always held central its critique of education toward this social transformation. Thus, my project as a critical race theorist, while inherently concerned with the rhetoric and writing of CRT, is also intrinsically invested in arguing for CRT's pedagogical potential. CRT exemplars, Delgado, Bell, and Williams, consistently speak through Counterstory and other methods of critical self-reflection regarding their roles as teachers in relation to their students. Delgado crafted a chronicle's worth of composite dialogues among composite teacher-student characters, Rodrigo and the professor. Bell, a self-proclaimed student to Geneva Crenshaw, crafted counter stories to teach in the classroom as supplementary to the textbook he wrote for his Harvard seminar. Again, a book students took it upon themselves to keep teaching in their own seminar after he left Harvard. Likewise, Delgado, along with his partner Stefancic, produced the accessible Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which you see the cover of here. It's a book that Harris describes as a primer for non-lawyers and makes the now sprawling literature of critical race theory easily accessible to the beginner. Intended for a new generation of critical race scholars, Delgado and Stefancic's book employs reader-friendly language, absent of buzzwords and jargon, covering CRT's central themes, critiques, and implications. Within this important educational text, the authors offer teachers and students classroom exercises for practical application and a glossary of key terms. At the conclusion of each chapter provides discussion questions, short lists of suggested readings, etc. It's a great resource. Last, Deborah Ware Post has commented that Williams' narratives are fundamentally reflections on her experiences as a teacher. Because I'm a teacher scholar situated in, yes, rhetoric and writing studies, but also very much influenced by literacy studies, my work as a critical race educator makes space for a synergy of CRT scholarship histories and theories that are located primarily in legal studies and education. In light of and as a contribution to this methodology of counterstory in the framing of rhetoric and writing studies pedagogy and curriculum development. Thus, the provided concluding chapter of my book reviews the ways CRT and counterstory have informed and influenced my teaching practice and my crafting and teaching of courses within the context of rhetoric and writing studies departments and programs. Specifically discussed within the provided chapter are pedagogical materials such as syllabi and course plans, ideologically framed by CRT and counterstory. In all, my goal in this work is to extend the conversations about CRT counterstory as research and writing method toward pedagogy and curriculum development for those who wish to put into practice the rich theories and histories of this methodology. Some questions to consider at the conclusion of this talk, but also forward-facing, are the following. How does CRT and counterstory as frame change the way we build courses? What becomes different? I suggest we begin by looking at core curricula, because these constitute the courses in which the already minoritized become marginalized, and nothing is more central to the ideologies and the teachings of disciplines and fields than their core curricula. The core is where master narratives have the potential to take root and are reinforced and sanctioned through the institutional racism of rhetoric and writing studies, and, for instance, disciplinary constructs, resulting in classroom-specific racial violence towards students and teachers of color. And while I acknowledge and appreciate the work of an elective curricula, I am more than aware of the marginalizing function elective courses serve for already minoritized perspectives. In 2021, minoritized peoples and our perspectives are still not considered core course material in the usually white racist imaginary. And when assessing the master narrative concerning the core curriculum, this hegemonic story, which even people of color at times buy into, we are still being told for no less than 12 years in our elementary and secondary school educations that the core curriculum is by and large the domain of white Euro-Western perspectives and ways of knowing. The core curriculum is the occupied space of white racialized perspectives, while the voices and stories of the racialized other are pushed to the margins in elective courses at best, or footnotes and asides within the core curriculum at worst. With the above in mind, it is also no surprise that ethnocentric white students only tolerate the work of people of color when it comes in the form of electives, so they can elect not to take these courses. Equally unsurprising is when these same students become angry and resistant upon realizing that my approach to these core courses they cannot opt out of because of their major specific degree requirements, centralizes the rhetorics and theories of people of color, albeit still in conversation with white folk. In all, the direction toward transformative education really is where the work begun in my book travels next. Because I was not able to publish Counterstory without first learning about it and its methods, because I did not use CRT and Counterstory to frame my own curriculum development without first learning about its socially transformative roots and implications, I conclude this presentation with a call to action to embrace our identities as students forever in the process of becoming, who are still capable of learning and reframing education in rhetoric and writing studies or your respective fields toward the social transformation called into action by critical race theory and counterstory. In rhetoric, composition, and writing studies, scholar Carmen Kennard has called for greater attention toward critical race theory in order to better prepare as teachers, scholar, administrators, and activists to be institutionally and pedagogically anti-racist. Kennard has astutely observed that, quote, despite everyone's seeming incessant discussion of critical theories from post-colonialism, decolonization to intersectionality, theories can become merely the stage for an academic performance, not a way of engaging the world and oppression in it. Following Kennard's example, my work suggests it is crucial to use theory and methodology and pedagogy to counter those that seek to dismiss or decenter racism and those whose lives are daily affected by it. Counterstory, then, is both method and methodology. It is a method for telling stories of people whose experiences are often not told, and as informed by CRT, this methodology serves to expose, analyze, and challenge majoritarian stories of racialized privilege. Counterstory can help to strengthen traditions of social, political, and cultural survival, resistance, and justice. Whether presented as primary texts within class, assigned to students as writing and method, or applied as a framework by teachers to transform curriculum, counterstories teach us that construction of another world, a socially and racially just world, is possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that excellent talk, Asia. We're really grateful, and I can see some of the thank yous popping up in the chat. I want to direct everyone to the Q&A now. We've got time for Q&A, so I'm going to ask that you go ahead and post your questions. Just the kind of webinar format directs us into the Q&A. So if you could post your questions to the Q&A, we'll be able to field them there and send them over to Asia. Zoe, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yes, would it be okay if I start with a question while folks are getting started? Okay, so first of all, participants and audience, Now is your opportunity to join us in this program by contributing a question in the Q&A box. So go ahead and type in your questions. We're really excited to see what you all have to say. I saw like thumbs up and clapping icons in the chat box while Dr. Martinez was speaking, and I had the same instinct. I was like, yes, this is so great. So thank you, Dr. Martinez. That was honestly very inspirational, and it was exciting. And it made me think of the teachers who I see who are here with us tonight, and the student teachers I know who are here with us. And many folks today are more interested in teaching about racial equality and racial justice than they were 5 or 10 years ago. And I know this because part of my work at Montclair State is to train teachers and student teachers in anti-racist education. And there's been a huge increase in interest among educators with questions about how to do that and what's the most effective way to do that and how do they get better at doing that. And there's this real kind of hunger for knowledge and understanding. Many white teachers are really joining us at the table in new ways. And we can see that. I live in the town of Montclair, and there's Black Lives Matter, signs and flags up in every yard that have gone up in the past couple of years, and more people attending protests in support of racial justice. So there's this new movement. And I think, hearing your ideas about how to transform curriculum and pedagogy are just wonderful and timely and important. But I know from working with a lot of teachers that one of the inherent kind of tensions or challenges, especially for K through 12 teachers who work with young people, sometimes very young, sometimes elementary age students, and they want to introduce these lessons on anti-racism, and they want to decolonize the curriculum, and they want to talk about racial injustice, and they want to help students understand it, which, like you said, it means getting rid of that colorblind philosophy that many of us have embraced for a long time, and being willing to have some challenging conversations about race. But for teachers working with young people, there's this tension. And one of the things I hear from teachers is that they want to talk about this. They want to tell students about, for example, the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, and really dig in and talk about how oppressive these systems were and how lasting they were and how we're still dealing with the consequences today. And on the other hand, they don't want to overwhelm children or young adolescents with a sense of hopelessness or despair, or a sense that their own racial identity is among people who have been treated very poorly and who have been oppressed. And so there's this tension for educators. So what would you say to teachers who are trying to figure out the way to talk about these challenging things with young people while also instilling a sense of positive self-esteem and hope for a better future?
I would say I don't think there's anything more positive that you can do for a student than centralizing their experiences and teaching them methods and methodology to do the work in that class that is honoring of their families, their histories, their experiences. And so one example, again, is from very personal experience. My book starts with a prologue that is a review of my grandfather's stories. And he was my first storyteller. He's the reason I'm so heavily invested in storytelling in the ways that I am as a researcher. And the thing that I remember so distinctly as a young learner in elementary school was that I was learning this version of American history that peaked in my head that I had heard before from my grandfather, but I didn't hear it in that way. There was another version of it that I had heard at home from this Mexican American, indigenous, migratory sort of experience that was absent or very heavily footnoted or put to a side in the histories I was learning in the classroom. And so part of it is about, building curriculum that isn't necessarily about like, oh, what are the, tales of woe that come from your family, but what are the inspirational things that come from your family? This is a very inspirational story about my family migrated to the US, our indigenous roots, our work on the railroad, our ways of being placed into, California and then displaced during the Depression. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there that, again, some of these kids, again, when you think of like the funds of knowledge concept, right? They know from their families, they have those stories. And so I think that is very affirming. And if I had been given the space to, contribute or have an assignment that helped me contribute that story to the other histories we were learning, and also just having the teachers not necessarily say this is like the evil history, right? Like this is the racist bad history. This is a version of history that is sanctioned by, like, I don't know, whoever. But we also know and acknowledge that your families probably have other stories that are in conversation or were happening side by side with some of these things we're learning about. And so that can be a matter of, getting parents involved, doing early ethnography with young people, right? I mean, whatever level they're at, you can, tailor it to that sort of thing. But I think that's very affirming. That is very much centralizing their experiences and making it so that they feel like they have a place. I wasn't offered the first opportunity to contribute my grandfather's stories until I was an undergraduate ready to graduate for my 4-year degree. Like if that was the first time that there was space made by an educator for me to do that, means one, that there's space that can be made by educators to do that, and two, that it would have been really amazing to have done that as a second grader. The other thing though, I think is I'm very much inspired by the work of education scholars Daniel Solorzano, who's over at UCLA, and his student, who I think she's at Riverside now, Tara Yoso. They did a study they've done a few studies, but based on these educational pipelines that educators are able to, craft based on census data. And so I think what I'm going to do next is just kind of show an example of what I'm talking about in this regard. And this is from a talk I gave for another group a couple weeks ago, but I'll share this with everyone so you have these materials as well. This link will take us to, and let me screen share again, this folder. And in this folder, this was more for like a writing of Counterstory oriented talk. And so anyone who's interested in that can take a look. But this particular presentation had this pipeline that, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. Which is taken again from Solorzano and Yoso's work and is directly drawn from census numbers, directly drawn from census numbers that say that for every 100 Mexican American or Chicana or Chicanx students who start elementary school, over half are gone by high school graduation. And 0.2 end up me where I'm at. And so this is a thing, and you can, as educators discerning for what level you're working with, can think about, so if I present this document to students and just leave it at this, we're left to our own devices in terms of the master narratives we know to make sense of numbers like this. We're left to craft the narratives out of, again, what society's telling us about Mexican Americans, about why these numbers look the way they do. And so again, back to the affirming, I think if we left it at this and just presented something like this to our students and said, dang, you guys really don't make it in school, do you? This is, again, where Counterstory comes into play as a practice, because one of the things that I did with this particular pipeline, again, particularly influenced by Tara Yoso's work, because her book, Counterstories Along the Chicano-Chicanx or Educational Pipeline, she does it by chapters. But what I did for another piece that I was working on is let me get us to that as well. It's in the same folder. In this folder of Counterstories, one of the pieces I published were little short stories that, again, this could be done with younger students, that kind of stopped at the different points along the pipeline, with short vignettes, short stories. You can see the statistics here, But what this did, for me as the person telling the story, it gave me the opportunity to say more about what was going on in that number box, right? That can only be interpreted, I think, with that master narrative, if we're not given the opportunity and space by educators to say, well, what else is going on here? Because is it just that we are dropouts? Is it just that we are people who don't value education? Or is there more to that story? All right. And so I'll just quickly read this one part so, the audience can actually see, well, what is it that's going on at this pipeline stop? And so this is the high school one. And this is my character that I write all the time. Her name is Alejandra, okay? And this is reflecting that statistic in that box, the 46 out of 100, okay? So what's the counter story to that number? But you're always writing, said cousin Chucho, accusation in his voice. Alejandra and her primo were sitting at their abuela's kitchen table, a place they spent all of their after-school hours before their parents picked them up after work. Alejandra could usually be found bent over her homework. Chucho was usually chomping noisily on comida and poking at her when things got too quiet. Ugh, Alejandra sighed in exasperation. I told you, Chucho, this paper is really important. If I don't finish it for our mock trial team, I'll be in deep shit. Ay, muchacha, tu lengua! A shout came from the adjacent living room. Alejandra and Chucho heard their abuela's recliner whine the way it did when she sat up abruptly as the volume of her telenovela was lowered significantly. Now they had her full attention. Sorry, abuela, said Alejandra, a sheepish grin exchanged with cousin Chucho's smirk. Malcriada, Chucho silently mouthed at Alejandra. Alejandra rolled her eyes at her primo, but they both remained silent for a few moments more until their abuela turned the volume back up. But the game starts in 10 minutes, Chucho continued, a slight whine accenting the 10. Are you really going to miss homecoming to write a stupid paper for a stupid law club? Chucho, came a yell from the living room again. How does she always hear us, even with the novela full blast? Chucho hissed in a whisper. Déjala, abuela continued. Alejandra needs to write that paper. She's going to be an abogada, which you'll need someday if you don't stop being such a travieso. Chucho looked indignantly in the general direction of his abuela's disembodied voice. He took an angry bite of his quesadilla and vigorously chewed. His nostrils flared. Thanks, abuela, Alejandra trilled sweetly, following it up by sticking her tongue out at her cousin. He returned the gesture with a choice finger. Okay, so the point is that we can teach students the realities of those statistics of being pushed out of education, of, achievement and whatever their ethnic, identifications are. But we can also teach them the pathways to expand that statistic and fill in the blanks with these counter stories that help explain what else is going on there, right? This isn't particularly dire, but it's kind of that tension that is being shown in that counter story between a very supportive family member and maybe a distracting family member, and what it's like to try to be an academic achiever in that space. And so it's not completely crapping on the culture from which Alejandra comes, right? It is showing that there is a supportive family member. Maybe that abuela's not sitting at the table right next to her helping her do the work, but she's supportive, right? She's scolding and reprimanding the cousin. And the cousin is, being, maybe an inhibitor that could be more representative of the statistics that are that, less than 46%. And it does both. And it humanizes the data, I guess is what the point is. Okay, so when the data looks the way it does in the number form drawn from census numbers, it can only tell us so much. And a lot of us, including people of color, default to that master narrative that is racist, and inhibiting and definitely detrimental for longer term goals and self-esteem and all these things. Okay. And so I would think that that tension that teachers are identifying, if there's flexibility being imagined about the kinds of assignments, the kinds of space that could be made in curriculum with things like Counterstory, this is what critical race theory offers. And I'll say one more thing about that before I stop for other questions, is that Derek Bell, who is considered, like, if you want to be patriarchal about it, like the godfather of critical race theory and Counterstory, he was very explicit in saying that he was teaching, and this is like not K through 12, he was teaching constitutional law at Harvard. He crafted counter stories so that his students could have access points to things like the Constitution, which is a very inaccessible sort of text, even for Harvard law students, right? And so he crafted characters, dialogue settings, so we don't even have to just leave it up to our students. We can be the ones crafting the counter stories to teach these times in history or these theories or these methods to young people all the way up to, again, Harvard law students who need access points to the content. Okay, so I'll stop there, and if there are other questions.
That was so helpful, and it was such a great treat to get that additional reading too. So thank you so much for that. There are some great questions in the chat, and I want to try to get to as many as we can. I think I'm going to just pull one quickly that from Chiana Martinez that kind of asks for how do we support educators who want to do this work, right? So I'm going to just read this question quickly here. As educators, we're in charge of gatekeeping, but the way we're trained stems from a history of racism that perpetuates the myth of meritocracy. How do we contend with that while also teaching from a CRT perspective?
Okay. And let me get to, okay, we're in charge.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I think part of that is linking back to those tenets, particularly the tenets of challenging dominant ideologies, but also that heuristic that's offered by Ladson Billings of kind of historically situating the work we're doing. And so what that does is that I think forces transparency in certain ways and requires it, demands it, if you will, in terms of how we explain things to our students, right? And so one of the places that comes up a lot in my field is with language and language use, especially with an English only sort of context with is this country, and the ways in which that gets implemented in writing spaces, especially writing center spaces, you know, where students are being sent to get their writing fixed. And so there's the idea of not sharing and being transparent about the histories, the context, the, you know, policies that have gone into place to create that circumstance. And I say this also from experience working in a writing center, especially with international students who in some cases are crazy educated, right? They're coming to us with master's degrees from their, you know, other countries and being sent to the writing center by monolingual English only professors who have never been called on to speak, much less write in another language, especially at the academic level, and just being sent, you know, forthright to have their writing fixed. And so part of it has been that for me is just saying, you know, like, this is where that comes from. And part of it is just that, you know, like, you're being taught by a professor who doesn't know what it is to write at the academic level in another language. And that, you know, just having the ability to have transparent conversations, again, at whatever level it is that your students are working at, but telling them not just what, but the why behind the process that you're teaching. And I think that even, I think about that a lot in terms of even things that are kind of forced to be taught because of state standards or whatever, right? When we're learning the great authors, for instance, in, you know, like, let's say literature classes, part of the conversation that can happen with that is like how that came to be, you know, like what processes were in place to get it to the point where these three, you know, white males are the ones that we have to know the names of before we can progress into these other classes or these other literatures that are othered in a lot of ways. So for me, it's really that basic concept of having a transparent sort of orientation with our students that discusses the why behind the what that we're teaching in our classrooms.
I really love that humility too, of that kind of, you know, you're being taught by a professor who doesn't know what it is too, you know, I mean, and that kind of the humility that's grounded there and opens up room for this kind of big subjective shift too for the student. So powerful stuff.
And it's one that we're wondering, right? Because that was the thing that I was talking about with my grandfather's stories. I was like, why didn't I hear his version this time? And no one ever answered that for me. And so to have a teacher preemptively provide that information, even if they can't provide that history, at least providing the space to converse about that is huge.
And to recognize that you have the story to tell, that perhaps they don't, that then can kind of enter into this space, and then we can learn something together. That's just, I mean, I'm scrolling up because otherwise I'll keep talking. I'm scrolling up on the Q&A so I can try to get to all of them, I hope. We'll move through. We did talk a bit, it was a great question from Adrian DeVore about early childhood and inclusive education. And I know we did talk a bit about that. So perhaps, we want to come back to it, although trying to think about inclusion, is another piece for us. So I will kind of sort of tack that one for now, if that sounds okay, so we can maybe return to it. And I'll go to the next one underneath from my colleague, Ron Brooks. Can you talk to us about your writing process, either for the writing of Counterstory or just about your daily or weekly or whatever writing process, like your own process? What's that like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the earliest counter stories I wrote, the first published one from 2014 was something I wrote as a grad student when I was particularly troubled. And so some of my counter stories come almost as aspects of what feel like poison in my body that will stay there unless I write it, unless I get it out. And they're from troubling experiences of things that have happened, things that I'm trying to figure out and explain. And the reality of Counterstory for me, as a person who has studied it and has now employed writing of it, is that I didn't know a way to express these unjust things that were happening to me, especially in grad school, until I was able to find this method and methodology. And once I happened upon that and started researching it and then realizing, oh, okay, this is what's going on. That was when I was able to start expressing in certain ways. And so oftentimes my counter stories start as just these, expressions, right? Just get out the narrative and then kind of dial back and start looking at, okay, where does this then inform data that exists? Okay, where is this in conversation with other sources of statistics or literatures or anything else of that nature? Because my counter stories are by and large composite, which is a braiding together of different data sources, including the personal. And so oftentimes, like I said, I'll start with that personal strand, but then I'll start to do the research or think about how, oh, this thing I read actually does inform this thing that came out as a personal narrative, and then figure out the ways to braid those strands together to then inform characters I build or dialogues I build or settings. The thing about Counterstory, and this is kind of why I went ahead and shared that folder of the different methods that I've parsed them out into, is that not all of the content or the topics that I want to discuss will do well or be received the same in each method. And I think that's true of any research, right? And so there's certain conversations that are best had in this kind of vignette form, whereas others are best had in these other forms like dialogue. And so I'll show an example of that just to help answer this question further. So I'm going to go into a screen share again. And oops, I got out of that. Let's see, one second. Let me go back to, where is it? There it is. Okay. These counter stories. So one of them in the narrative folder is directly drawn from my book. It's from my 4th chapter, and it's a counter story as Burkean parlor is what I've called it. And this could again apply as a classroom writing exercise too for some of the more advanced students that maybe we're working with, like high school students. But what you'll see here as far as writing process, and I think this is really interesting because it's kind of a way that I was able to make counter story fit data that I already had, pre-existing data. I had quotes from these scholars listed here, okay, who all take up in certain ways narrative theory. They've all theorized narrative and justified why and how they do it in their own work, in their own bodies of work, whether it be monographs or other things. And so I had over the years chunks of quotes pulled from these different works from these different authors. And when I returned to these chunks of quotes, when I was getting ready to compose this chapter and knew that those quotes needed to go in here, I realized these quotes are beautiful, beautifully stated phrasings and justifications for why they do the work that I don't want to chop up, that I don't want to paraphrase. I don't want to do anything to these quotes to make them not intact in the ways that they already are. But I didn't have a method such as traditional lit review that would allow me that kind of process as far as my writing was concerned. And so what I did is I thought, how can I keep these intact and still do the work of a literature review, which still shows that I have good handle on the topics that are being discussed. There's a central topic that they're all corresponding to, and wherever it is that I'm, contributing or joining the conversation. One of the things we tell students, especially about lit reviews or annotated bibliographies or those sorts of research writing processes, is put these authors in conversation with one another. Yeah. Well, Delgado, in his method of dialogue, has offered exactly that method of putting characters in conversation with each other. And so that's what I did with these authors. I arranged this into a conversation that looks like a scripted dialogue, and you'll see here where there's names. So the citation of the author is there, but there's also animation, but their quotes are intact and their quotes are cited from the bodies of work from which they've been drawn. And so there's a lot that has potential here for both teaching and learning if this was something that you as an educator put together to help introduce your students to a new concept, is that this reads, again, and you can assign students roles, right? You can have them read these different authors and they're reading actual quoted text from these people's original works or interviews. I've taken it from a few things, but if you're having students do this, this is a great way to, yes, be kind of playful and push at that genre of lit review, but still accomplish the objectives of it, which are making sure they understand the text enough to pull material from it, putting them in on conversation, putting yourself in there in terms of your own concerns, your own, topic that you're weaving throughout, but also citation practice, because that also exists here. So that's just an example of writing process for me as far as starting with the data, I guess. So I guess that's the long story short. I start with the data.
It's that is really, really brilliant, and thank you for showing us that too. And I have a million more questions, but I'm going to stick to the Q&A because folks are lined up here and waiting. So the next question comes from Mia Kirk. About how likely is it that the use of Counterstory as a pedagogical approach will become prioritized in K-12 schools?
Mm-hmm. How likely is it? Well, I guess it has to do with those who are learning about it, because it's not been a non-existent field of study in education. There's a few very particular places where teachers, educators are being trained by some of the most prominent names. Okay, so University of Wisconsin-Madison has Gloria Ladson-Billings there. I believe the Ohio State has Adrian Dixon, who I mentioned in the talk. UCLA has Danny Solorzano, and they all have students, who have gone all over the country. And so there are professors in education programs who are offering this material to teachers. And so there is that aspect of it where it can be gleaned in the, 4-year or even master's level educations. But in terms of the likelihood, for me, especially in this moment where so much backlash is happening at a national and state level, it really does boil down to more opportunities for teachers to attend, I think, sessions like this, not just with me, but with everyone else who, before me, long before me, has been doing critical race theory in education. I know Gloria Ladson-Billings in particular is like running the circuit, trying to, even though she's retired technically, right, like still trying to get the word out about what it actually is, because that's what the problem is right now, is that back to the concept of master narrative, there's a master narrative being promoted about what critical race theory is. It is critical and it is uncomfortable for some folks, especially if you are particularly moored to white supremacy. If that's important to you and you are very much, aligned with that, you're going to feel challenged by it. But if you're ready to, think about that, even if that is a privilege that you have, then learning about the tenets, learning about the heuristic, learning about that history, learning about how they apply to the way we can form and craft curriculum and courses and teacher education, all that sort of thing. I think that's the way for it to pick up, is getting people really actually educated on what it is, and that it's not this scary monster that is being made out in the legislatures around this country. But that would take, a pretty big movement oriented effort, but that's not something unfamiliar to critical race theorists, right? It started as a movement. So I think, yeah, just the more like you all here who are learning today, if this is something that you think you want to take up, you're vastly more educated on it now than most of our state legislatures who are banning it, so that's important. That's a really important thing. And I guess that's my answer.
Thank you for that. And the next question that we have, I think it's a exciting one, because I think in certain ways you've actually already even modeled some of this, which is to think about how to centralize students' experiences and family histories in seemingly objective courses like math or science. And I think you've already been playing with this a little bit. I wonder if you might comment on that a bit further.
Yeah. So the one thing that, and I say this with other STEM audiences I've been with before, is that all data is narrativized at some point for various reasons, even if it's just to put it into the form so that it's something that can be understood by audiences who are not expert or specialized in whatever that more like science oriented field is. And so when you think about, again, how storytelling works in something like the STEM fields, there's definitely personal and family histories that can be pulled from to inform the way that numbers are thought of, or the way like science and medicine is dealt with in other cultures or other epistemologies, if you will. But if you're working with, especially again, more advanced students who are trying to think about ways to share their work at like science fairs or any kind of presentation oriented venues, you're going to be teaching them about the ways that they are making story and making sense of this data for their audiences, and their audience are going to be multiple. And so that's why I think rhetoric as an approach to this work is really important, because you're teaching students that depending on what you're trying to accomplish with the results of whatever your study is, there's going to be a different audience. It's going to need a different way for it to be communicated. If your work is oriented toward helping, let's say, your home community with some sort of health issue, how do you need to put it into a form that is going to be received well, accepted by these communities? One of the most recent examples is the sort of racialized statistics regarding the COVID vaccine, and how there's a lot of exasperation or just questions about why certain communities of color are not jumping at the opportunity to get this vaccine. Well, what that requires, especially again for young learners who are maybe going to go into these fields of being the people presenting their findings about, let's say, this vaccine, is that there's a history of violence towards certain communities of color when it comes to the medicine industry, right? There's also certain ways of presenting information that might be more engaging, that is in a narrative form, that can get people more on board with wanting to listen and buy into these processes. And so there are approaches for, I would say, any field, because again, we always learn by story, we communicate by story. And I think acknowledging that, especially in the sciences or the more objective type fields, is a important starting point. Yeah.
For sure. Thank you so much for that. A lot to think about. The next question comes from my colleague, Caroline Datis, building on your comment about how you did not have an opportunity to tell the stories of your grandfather until you were almost out of undergrad. Have you found the literacy narrative genre an effective opportunity for students to engage in Counterstory? We have recently incorporated this genre into our first year writing classes and are continuing to explore how to make this writing assignment an enriching one for students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the only thing that I would say about literacy narrative, especially as a genre, is that I would caution against reducing Counterstory to genre, because it's methodology. And that's the point I think that is important about it. It's a narrative method, but it's informed by and it's linked to and framed by critical race theory. And literacy narrative can be narrative about really anything, right? And so if you're going to call what you're doing Counterstory, you will really want to make sure that it's coming out of that framework that has birthed it as a methodology, which is critical race theory. So write narratives, write literacy narratives, do that work. I think that's great as a practice, especially for students to learn how to use that voice and those different skills and tools. But if it's Counterstory that you want to teach them, and maybe you start with the literacy narrative and segue into Counterstory, make sure that they're also learning the tenets, because that's the framework that informs the methodology of critical race theory. And then informing and insisting on, especially not just, I think students buy in a lot easier than other professors and administrators, but insisting this is methodology, this is the way that is informed by theory about doing and going about research. Okay, and so this is a way to gather data, this is the way to put it together, and this is the way to present it. Yeah. And so that's another, as far as sequence goes, right, in a first year writing seminar, or even, a high school writing seminar, is that if you want to start them with the skill set of how to write in a narrative voice, and then get them to the methodology of how you gather data to then put it into this narrative form, that gets us closer to what Counterstory is asking us to consider.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Another question from Chedia Ayari: how to apply CRT within higher education context with faculty who are teaching English language learners in a mainstream classroom, yet they struggle with personal and institutional tensions of viewing such a task as part of their job.
Personal institutional attention review. Mm-hmm. What is the task that that's the part that I'm lost with this question.
Yeah, let's see. I guess that is the task, and you can certainly add to the Q&A, Chedia, if you'd like. Is the task actually one, teaching English language learners? So essentially this notion of teaching what is considered sort of teaching English in a kind of traditional sense. Is that what teaching this sort of a kind of attachment to this notion of a standard basic English, or is applying CRT the task in the classroom? So that feels like is that where you're not sure, Asia?
Yeah, I'm not sure. If it's the applying the CRT part, again, that can be twofold in terms of what an educator is willing to take on. If you, and that's part of why I provided the syllabi at the end of that chapter, is that the first two are more explicitly like syllabi by an educator who knows CRT really well, is going to teach courses very focused on CRT content and methodology and that sort of thing. Okay, and so that's a lot of work, right? That does take quite a bit of research and learning on the part of the educator. And maybe I think this is what the question is asking. People are feeling like, well, I don't have a lot of time for that, right? Like, that's not my area. That's not what I want to study. And that's fine, and not all of us have to be experts in that regard. That's why we attend things like this, right? Or other sorts of ways that we find out this stuff. But the other two syllabi, the C and D syllabi, are the ones that are more framed by the educator, where we're not explicitly teaching students CRT, we're letting those tenets inform the way we put the course together. So if we're teaching, like English language learners, back to kind of one of the previous questions, one of the things that can be taught within, like whatever that course is some of the stuff about the processes by which, we ended up, I don't know, a monolingual country, right? Because that's an ideological thing that one of the tenets of CRT says, push against ideology, question it. Okay, and that can be presented as part of what is learned about, is that like, how do we find ourselves in this situation where this language is being insisted upon for the purposes of succeeding educationally in this country, right? And so that's just an example, but my point is that you can frame the way that you include topics or craft assignments or do anything of that nature for your own courses with those tenets of CRT without having to, go the next step of knowing it so well that you're teaching it to students. So I hope that makes sense. There's two ways that you can approach it.
That's really helpful. And it does look like you hit on the focus there. So thank you very much for that. So our last question, I think, perfect timing and such an important one. How do you respond to what can, or how do you respond to, or what can be done to counter the pushback against teaching CRT?
I mean, I just feel like this is in real time. So that's a very good question. It's a very hard to answer question, because I feel like all of us who have been doing this work And, you know, I don't count myself as one of the longest standing folks, right? Like I learned from those people who have been doing this work for much longer than me, sometimes, you know, 40 years more than I have. But one of the things that I will say is that never in my wildest imagination did I think, when I started this project as a grad student in like 2007 or whenever I first happened upon this work, that fast forward to 2020, when my book came out, would be the same year that it would hit the national stage in the way it has, with the backlash that it has. And so I guess the biggest response I have, is that, and I've seen this on Twitter from others who are better at, you know, like the quips and the hot takes than I am. And so I don't really do that, but I've seen other people pretty quickly respond, well, what do you know about CRT? What is it? You know, how would you define it? And I think that actually happened just the other day with, was it Mark Lamont Hill and some conservative, you know, somebody. And that was the question he posed right to the person. That person lost his mind, you know, like he just could not stand being asked that question, because at the end of the day, he didn't actually know. He didn't have a definition for what it was. He just knew that it was a buzzword, and it was a taboo buzzword, and that's the one that we're using as an umbrella term to apply to everything that we think of is, you know, bad and threatening to, you know, our American ideals or whatever. And so I think that's the first thing that any of us can do to push back on, is to, one, educate ourselves about what it is, which all of you have done today, which is wonderful, and to continue to do that, and to go back to the foundational sources, which is what Gloria Ladson-Billings called for when that first order was issued by Trump back in September, is to go back to the original sources, read what they were actually saying, understand what critical race theory is actually built on, understand what it's not. And actually, Ladson-Billings has an article that says critical race theory, what it's not. She has a whole piece of work that breaks it down in that way, that she wrote several years ago before any of this happened. And then move forward with that knowledge, and move forward with that knowledge in terms of, you know, anybody who wants to, you know, say, oh, it's all this horrible, you know, scary stuff, and say, well, it's actually this stuff. And if that's still scary to people, then okay, fine, you know, but at least, like I said at the beginning of this talk, they know what it is, you know, because I teach students who, you know, have taken my courses, one in particular, 3 semesters in a row. He still doesn't agree with me. He still thinks it's, you know, a bunch of crap. But I guess I can be satisfied that he knows what it is moving
Keep
forward.
showing up.
Yeah. So, yeah. So that's.
And you know, I think even I believe even Twitter now has a feature that says, you know, are you sure you want to share this? You didn't open the link. You didn't open the article. Do you want to read it first? And so, you know, read it. The practice of humility. Really great stuff. So so I think Zoe just put in the chat for educators, certificate for professional development time for our K-12 colleagues who are with us. Lots of thank yous coming into the chat on behalf of everyone here today. Many, many thanks to Dr. Asia Martinez for a great talk. We're so grateful to have spent this time with you.
Awesome. Thank you all for the honor.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.